This is a story that people, well, a lot of people are probably not going to like. It's about a man who most of us haven't heard of him. But if we have, we think of him as a villain, as one of the worst people who ever lived in North America ever. When it does come up, his name is often likened to a bad, hot weather system. He's someone who killed several of our American heroes and almost killed several more, ones who are indeed household names. He's reviled, not only here in the United States, but also in one of our neighboring countries. Bringing up his name invokes an era of corruption and the decline of governments. And yet it comes from a very, very different perspective as to why. You would be forgiven if you have no idea who I'm talking about. But I'm going to tell you right now that he's one of the most important people who ever lived on this continent and maybe in the entire world. And he needs a second look. Because Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, in my opinion, has been wronged by history. Because he is not the villain that we think he is. We got him entirely wrong. And you may have some opinions about this name, or maybe you've never heard of him at all. And I'm not going to claim that he did everything right in his life, or that he won battles, victories, legal or, with the force of arms, that he didn't. I'm not going to say he didn't commit atrocities. But I am going to say that by the standards of his time, Santa Anna was undoubtedly a hero. And, you may want to just turn off this podcast right now if you know who I'm talking about, if you know anything about his history. You may want to go to another channel. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History is quite fun. He has a great series on the Mongols that you may enjoy. But if you choose to stick around, I'm going to tell you that the arc of this man is going to astound you. It's going to make you reconsider, well, a lot of things about the world. And, I have been working for, believe this or not, 10 years on a book about Santa Anna. And it's a book that has gone through many iterations, and it may never come out. For reasons that I'm probably not going to go into. I may never release this book, or maybe I'll do it later in life. But it's a story that I feel like I have to tell, and I'm going to tell it in this podcast, and we'll see how long this podcast goes. Like my recent podcast about the monk who fucked everything, I'm going to do this by recounting the timeline of Santa Anna's life. I'm going to take you from the time he was a young and important military commander, just got his first horse sort of guy, all the way to the end of his life, which ends in an incredibly unexpected way. And at the end of this podcast, I want you to think, and maybe I'll post a vote in the bottom to see if you've changed your mind about him. If you think that maybe, just maybe, I'm onto something here, that Santa Anna is maybe the most important person in American history. And as I'm recording this, I don't know if this is being picked up by the microphone. I am in the middle of a torrential downpour. There is thunder and lightning atmospherically playing in the background, so maybe you'll hear some crashes every now and then. And I thought about recording later, but why not take the opportunity for what it is? Because this is a thunderous story. I'm going to take you back to 1821, to the country of New Spain, a place that you know now as Mexico, but was a Spanish colony since the conquistadors destroyed the Aztec Empire, took Mexico City, put much of the population to the sword, and started extracting resources and sending them back to Europe. At this time, New Spain is a mix of races, indigenous identities, colonial administrators and soldiers. It is a wild place from a European perspective. There is slavery here in this colonial outpost. But it's been a few hundred years since the Spanish had conquered this area of the world, and the populations, as populations do, had mixed pretty significantly, so that you had these Castilian, these sort of white Spanish folks. You had people who are of mixed race. And locally, they would call these people mestizos, who would be mixing between the indigenous populations and the European populations. You had black Africans who were brought over as slaves, and all of these people were working on the project of extracting resources and sending them back to Spain. As is always the case in these sorts of situations, this required a lot of military because, well, people do not like being slaves. They do not like being colonial subjects. And Santa Anna was born in the town of Vera, Cruz, on the east coast of what is now Mexico. It's a port city, which means it's important for sending goods out of New Spain and important for moving troops, receiving shipments. It's a pretty central place, and Santa Anna is born to a class of merchants, and there's a really good possibility that his mother is at least half indigenous. The family certainly did not talk about it, but Santa Anna, well, many people consider him a mestizo, a mixed race person. This makes it quite hard for him to advance in society because the society is quite racist. But one place where there is a certain amount of mobility is the army. The colonial Spanish army that is keeping everyone under a colonial boot heel. Well, if you're really a good fighter, you can do well in the army, and it doesn't matter about your race. He meets a guy named General Davila who takes him under his wing and surprisingly starts to promote Santa Anna when he's just a teenager into positions of power. Santa Anna becomes a noted cavalry officer and pulls off quite a few operations against bandits because there is this revolution that's going on. There are insurrections. There are people who do not want to be part of New Spain who are fighting New Spain. And Santa Anna is really, really good at capturing and killing or imprisoning these people. People would say of him that he's not necessarily the best tactician, but what he makes up for in lack of military rigor and planning, he makes up for in just straight courage on the battlefield. It's said that he's killed several of his adversaries by sword, which is sort of a big and crazy thing to do when you're the leader of a group of soldiers. He leads from the front, and his men love him for it. He joined the army when he was 16 in June 1810, part of the infantry, part of the cavalry. At one point, he's wounded in the hand when he gets shot by an arrow by some indigenous people who are resisting, but he still wins that battle. He fights up in Texas, where he's cited for his courage and his bravery at something called the Battle of Medina. He's a second lieutenant by 1812, so he is 18 years old. He stays in the Spanish army until he's 27 years old, advancing in the ranks slowly, but an officer. And in 1821, the Mexican Revolution has kicked off. And then there's this new idea which is circulating by a guy named Iturbide. It's called the Plan of Iguala. And what it suggests is that Mexico, this country of Mexico that doesn't yet exist, should be a home of equality for all men, regardless of their race. And they have a plan to stop discrimination by religion and race and allow anyone to grasp at opportunity, regardless of their heritage. And Santa Anna is about 27 years old, and he has his troops holed up in a monastery in his home state, and he's been cornered by rebel forces. The rebels have surrounded his position, and he has his men on the inside, and he realizes he could fight his way out of this. I mean, he's been in sticky spots before. He knows he could do it. But somehow, and it's a little unclear of exactly how this happened, but he meets with a rebel commander, someone from outside the walls, who slips him the Plan of Iguala written out, and something in Santa Anna's heart changes. He realizes in this moment that he wants to switch sides, that he doesn't want to be part of this Spanish colonial horror show. He wants to fight for the independence of his nation. And he sneaks out through the tunnels of this monastery and appears on the other side in his full military uniform. And he calls to his men from outside the garrison and says, "You should surrender and join me, and we will fight and kick the Spanish out of our country." And his men follow him. They follow him for the opportunity. They follow him because he leads from the front, and Santa Anna is about to kick some ass. He rides to his old hometown of Vera, Cruz, and on his way there, he sends a letter to Davila, the guy who picked him up and let him in the army from his merchant background, his father figure. And he says, "Hey, I want you to join me. I think you should join me for the freedom of our nation." And Davila can't stomach it. He is pissed. He calls Santa Anna a traitor. And so Santa Anna invades Veracruz. His soldiers stream through the streets, and Santa Anna sets up a cannon outside of Davila's home and blows the door off its hinges. Shortly thereafter, Veracruz falls. Veracruz serves under a Mexican general who is half black named Guerrero, and they fight until 1829. Now, in the time, there is a constant wrestling for power in a revolutionary movement. It's never clear who's really in charge. Santa Anna, at some point, actually gets a lot of attention from people, and his word really holds sway, and he runs Veracruz. But not everyone likes him. Eventually, though, at another port town called Tampico, the Spanish forgot to issue a naval blockade, and Santa Anna sees his opportunity and sends 5,000 troops to their rear, and he defeats the Spanish. They surrender unconditionally. Mexico is free of the Spanish, and Santa Anna gets the title Napoleon of the West. In fact, he starts dressing a lot like Napoleon. Napoleon was a big deal. It's at the time, Santa Anna admires Napoleon and sees himself as a great military leader, and he gets the accolades. He gets those shiny epaulets. He has the big hat, just like Napoleon, and people see him as an important military leader. But there's a problem in the Mexican government at the time. There is not a lot of unity. There are different parties vying for power. The man that Santa Anna served under, the half-black Guerrero, who is very, very liberal and actually has become president. Well, Guerrero wins against this other guy named Bustamante. And, well, let's just say it doesn't go very well for Guerrero. He's executed by Bustamante, And then shortly thereafter, Santa Anna avenges his former combat leader and deposes Bustamante, taking the presidency for himself. Now, of course, I'm glossing over quite a bit of Mexican history here, but you get the idea of where this is going. There are factions. Santa Anna is taking over the power, and he is a pretty liberal guy, but he's also realizing there's a problem. When you start ruling a country as diverse as Mexico, you're trying to get all of these federated lands to follow your decrees to actually run the country like some sort of centralized thing. Well, the Constitution that had been adopted in 1824, it made it very hard for a president to, rule. So he centralizes power, which then triggers rebellions all across Mexico and Texas. Santa Anna rescinds that constitution, and there's a new constitution in place. And one of the central ideals of it, beyond the whole power sharing thing, which, is problematic, one of the ideals is still this is going to be a country without slavery. This is going to be an abolitionist state, unlike that country to the north. It's a place where indigenous people have at least a seat at the table as far as countries allowed at that time. Santa Anna, it's noted that he doesn't particularly like ruling. He has this number 2 guy, a guy named Farias, and he oftentimes is known for going off into the country and just letting Farias run the country in his stead. And this will become an issue a little bit later. But there's also this other thing going on. Well, Mexico is huge, right? It reaches all the way down into the Gulf and all the way up through California and Colorado to the base of Oregon. Mexico is huge, and it's difficult to administer. And, starting in the 1820s, roughly, Texans, Americans who were sort of sick of their own country and the restrictions that America put on their own freedoms, they started looking at that unsettled Mexican territory as a pretty great deal. They were having trouble getting new slaves in America at that time because we'd abolished the international slave trade. And so the Texans came into Texas and created sort of a slave empire. I mean, the land wasn't empty. Of course, the Comanche were there, but they fought the Comanche in numerous engagements and founded several cities like Houston and Austin. They created a little tiny garrison called the Alamo out of an old Christian mission. Now, there's a great book that I think you should check out, which is called Forget the Alamo, about the tortured history of the Texans and the Battle of the Alamo. And it's a really, really great book. It's gotten a lot of awesome press, and it's worth it. Well, at least the first third of the book is worth it. I suggest you check it out. But Texas was becoming a pretty thorny thing. Not only was Mexico, former Spanish, former African slaves. Well, now we had this big Texan group to the north of the country, and they wanted to hold their own slave empire. They wanted to raise a whole little slave state inside the sovereign state of Mexico. Santa Anna wasn't having it. I mean, he did talk with the Texan leaders, and he jailed them as well when they came down. Austin was jailed in order to avert a civil war. Santa Anna gave some concessions, saying that you will abolish slavery in 5 years, which isn't the most liberal position, but it was what he had to deal with at the time, and the Texans seemed to be okay with it. But these Texans who had come there, the Daniel Boones and the Davy Crockett's, they stopped paying their taxes because they didn't believe in this centralized state ruling over them. And eventually, these slave-holding Texans declared independence. And Santa Anna, looking at the laws that existed in his country at the time, said that these people were pirates. Santa Anna, of mixed heritage himself, could not stomach the fact that part of his country that he fought and bled for, we're going to be enslaving other humans, and we're building their whole economy on it. So Santa Anna marched north with the Mexican army. Now, before I go on with recounting this fascinating history, I want to tell you about something exciting that I'm doing. When I started this podcast, I'll be honest, I didn't know how fun it would end up being. And I've been trying to figure out how to give you, the listener, the best possible experience of what it is that I do. I'll tell you, I hate the idea of running ads in this feed. I hate that experience of, something coming up and all of a sudden you're listening to like a McDonald's commercial. It's terrible. We all can admit that. I don't like it as a creator, and you definitely don't like it as a listener as you press that fast forward button to get through the commercials. So what I've done, and what I would like to invite you to, is my exclusive behind-the-scenes club over at Patreon, where I ask you for direct support for this show, and in return, you get ad-free content, exclusive voting power on, shows that I might put together in the future, and of course, very importantly, early access and behind-the-scenes stuff on Patreon. And I'm still learning the platform, but it's really fun. I have a couple tiers, and there's even a tier where there's a Discord group where you can come and talk to me in Discord, preferably by text. It's really fun. It's really fun, and I'm excited. And I only announced it a few days ago, and I've already got 10 people in there, and you could be the 11th. I'd love you to support the show however you can. And if you don't want to, well, that's okay too, because I'm not going to put ads in this anyway. But maybe you want to be part of it as I put it together. So that's my pitch to you. Go check me out on Patreon. You can just put my name into the search. There's a link down here in the show notes to that page. Check it out. Maybe there's something there that you might like to be part of. And I appreciate you listening. And now, well, I'm going to get back to the Alamo. So Santa Anna has marched north. There's actually two Mexican armies. Santa Anna controls one. The other is by a guy named Uria and Filasola. Meanwhile, the Texan volunteers, well, they're pretty outmatched. They're not outgunned. They actually have better guns than the Spanish, but they are just outmatched. A guy named Travis holes up in the Alamo. He's a young guy, and he has a cast of characters with him, including a former American congressman who heard about the Texas Revolution, and he wasn't actually going to be reelected anyway, but when it didn't go his way in the election, he said, "You can all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." This is, of course, Davy Crockett, who was a guy who I admired greatly as a young kid. When I watched the Disney special, I loved the coonskin cap and the wilderness folklore around him. But he was just a congressman from Tennessee who was an opportunist in reality. You got James Bowie of the Bowie knife, an Indian fighter. They're all slavers. They all believe in freedom up and to the point where you can actually own another human being, and they are fighting for this. I mean, it's been called the worst constitution in history. They're fighting for that ideal. Travis is, actually sort of brilliant. He writes a lot of letters while he is under siege because Santa Anna and his men pull up outside the Alamo and surround it, try to starve out the mission at first. There are about 180 men inside the Alamo, and Santa Anna has around 5,000. It's not going to go well for the Texans. Travis sends lots of letters out. I don't know how he sneaks them out, but the letters get out, and it actually starts raising a lot of attention to the Texan cause. It's said at this time, this is a sort of side part of history. It's said that Santa Anna, who's a bit of a Lothario, has a bit of a reputation as a ladies' man, actually sort of prolongs the siege because he's romancing ladies in the nearby town. I don't know how true it is, but I think it's sort of an interesting story. I also don't really know what counts as romancing at that time period. I do know that he proposes marriage to a woman and likely sleeps with her. But the military campaign still does press on. Eventually, Santa Anna has had enough with these Texan insurrectionists. He orders the trumpeters, the buglers, the musicians that follow him on military campaigns to play a song called Deguelo, which means cutthroat, which means don't take any prisoners. He's not a great military strategist. He orders a full frontal attack and he has too many casualties from this event, but he takes over the Alamo and he puts all of the Texan defenders to the sword, and he frees the women and the slaves. According to the book, Forget the Alamo, Davy Crockett is killed on his knees outside, executed legally under something called the Tornell Decree that says that you can execute pirates if they rebel. I mean, people execute pirates all the time. And, maybe it's not good form, and from our perspective here in 2023. But at that time, this was just de rigueur. This is just what you did. And I'm not saying it was savory, but it's what was done. Fresh off of his victory, Santa Anna goes down to the much larger garrison of Goliad and wins again. He executes 342 Texans. And it's funny, but the Battle of the Alamo, remember the Alamo, that was actually a much more minor battle than Goliad. Goliad had a much higher body count of Texans. And it looks, Santa Anna looks unstoppable at this point because the Texan forces are minuscule compared to the Mexican forces, the two Mexican armies. The Texan general, Sam Houston, decided not to reinforce the Alamo because he knew it was a lost cause. He let his men die. And then Houston goes on the run. Santa Anna chases him through March and April. And they get into this sort of boggy area outside of the modern town of Houston. And Santa Anna he thinks Houston sort of up against the wall. It's like sort of at this point, Santa Anna only has to say, let's go, guys, and call the charge. And he would probably just straight up defeat Houston. And, this is one of Santa Anna's many failings, but he is absolutely overconfident. According to one story that, frankly, is probably not true, but I'm going to recount it anyway, Santa Anna was too busy getting it on with a lady, a Creole lady, and he was making out with her or whatever Santa Anna was doing, and he forgets to post pickets. Pickets are sort of advanced soldiers that can skirmish and to delay a battle before it happens. He doesn't put up his watches, and he's underneath a tree with a lady who is later known as the Yellow Rose of Texas, which is a racist name for a song title, but it's a very, very famous song. You can go Google it up and listen to it on YouTube. Anyway, that song is supposedly about the flirtation that Santa Anna was having with a local lady when Sam Houston, perhaps just luckily, perhaps it was a fatalistic charge that he did not think that he would win, he charged Santa Anna's lines, and it is a massacre. They are shouting, remember Goliad, remember the Alamo. And as they do this, they cut down men as they flee. It is a bloodbath. It's called the Battle of San Jacinto, and it's just as brutal as the Alamo. And if you go back and you think about the Alamo and you say that Santa Anna was a horrible person for massacring everyone at the Alamo, then you have to equally look at the Battle of San Jacinto and say the same thing. Long after the Mexicans had put down their arms, the Texans still murdered with aplomb. Santa Anna, however, manages to escape, and it is a pathetic thing. He puts on the uniform of a Mexican army private and somehow sneaks away and is later rounded up and captured and surprisingly not killed. And now the story gets really, really interesting. Because it's not the story that you hear about, because we just think that once the Alamo has been lost and Goliad has been lost and the San Jacinto has been won, the Texans bring their freedom to the area of Texas, and then it's all hunky-dory for Texans. The Republic has been established. Well, that's not exactly what happened. Something entirely more bizarre occurs next. You know, from a strategic standpoint, the Mexicans hadn't actually lost this war yet. Remember how I said there were two armies on their way north? Well, Santa Anna's was vanquished, but Sam Houston still had to deal with the army of Ficiola. And it really wouldn't have been very hard for them to take the Texans a little more seriously, do slightly better tactics, and absolutely eradicate the Texans. But there was this problem, of course, that Santa Anna was now a prisoner. And Sam Houston had a choice. He goes to meet Santa Anna, the guy who killed all these other people, his own troops, at the Alamo, at Goliad. And he thinks to himself, I'm going to go execute Santa Anna in revenge. But first he has to talk to him. Sam Houston is boiling with rage. Undue rage, perhaps, because they're both guilty of these massacres. And he goes and he meets Santa Anna, who is in his private uniform, or maybe they let him change for the equivalent of a photo op. And here's where it gets super weird. Santa Anna offers his hand to Sam Houston, and they take it and exchange the secret symbol of the Freemasons. Yeah, I'm not making this up. Both men were Freemasons. It was like their private club of aristocrats, and they both shared something of a kinship. And Sam Houston, on this basis alone, decides to let Santa Anna live. And then Santa Anna starts to bargain. And he says, look, we have this other army that can easily bear down and destroy you. And in exchange for my life and the troops who are still alive with me, you will let us go, and I will tell the other army to go back to Mexico, and we will give Texas its independence. Sam Houston says no. Sam Houston says, look, you're a Freemason, and we do want to, not get destroyed by this other army, but no, Santa Anna, I will not free you. But your army can go if you sign the treaty. And Santa Anna considers this option and realizes it's better than getting hung right there. And he says, yes, I will order the Mexican army into retreat, and I will stay your prisoner. This is Santa Anna leading from the front again. This is Santa Anna to some degree. I mean, he's still somewhat self-serving, I won't lie, but he's at least saying, okay, great, save my troops' lives, don't execute everyone. And the Texas Revolution, well, you won it. They signed the Treaty of Velasco, which says that Mexican troops will stay south of the Rio Grande, and property rights, by which we mean slaves, they will be respected. When word of this treaty gets out, slaves who had been freed by the Mexicans as they went north flocked to the Mexican army and asked for their protection. And there's this whole caravan of freed African slaves who make it back into Mexico. Meanwhile, Santa Anna is in bondage, and Houston has to figure out what he wants to do with him. Now, for most Americans who are listening to this podcast right now, you're looking at the timestamp and you're like, what is going on? Why is there so much time left in this podcast? The Alamo has been dealt with, and yet there is so much more. Well, that's because Santa Anna is the most important person in North America and it has almost nothing to do with the Alamo. We, to some degree, are only just beginning. Put yourself in Sam Houston's shoes for just a second. He has he's won his independence from Mexico. There's this independent Texan, they call it a republic, but it's a Texan slave state. They have this slave state all to his own, and he is stuck between two superpowers. The United States to his east, Mexico to his south and to his west. And he has currently the president of Mexico in bondage. Well, that's a tough spot to be in, isn't it? Because not only is Santa Anna the best general that Mexico has, he's the president, he's the leader of a sovereign nation. What do you do with this guy? You can't send him right back down to Mexico. He might invade again. And you can't really hold him in your own country either. So Sam Houston decides to do something, well, which is bizarre. It's the bizarre choice out of all bizarre choices. He sends Santa Anna in cuffs on a wagon ride to Washington, D.C. to meet Andrew Jackson, the President of America. Isn't that just bizarre? Isn't that weird? I mean, at what point do you send your prisoners of war to another country? Well, that's exactly what Houston did. And Santa Anna starts, in a little wagon train starting in about June 1836 to January 1837, because this is still pretty wild country. It's not fast to get across the United States at that time. But in that time, Santa Anna sees a lot of America. He sees how it's industrializing in a way that he didn't really understand because he had only been in Mexico for most of his life. And he sees these budding factories. He sees these slave plantations. And, well, it's said that Santa Anna on this trip realizes something fundamental, which is that the real enemy, the real danger that Mexico is facing isn't just some insurgents and ruling his own country. It's this power of the American Industrial Revolution moving west and taking his country from him because America is powerful. And Santa Anna now knows in his long march to Washington, D.C. to meet the American president. And he is the president in absentia of Mexico. Along this trip, I like to think of Santa Anna as chewing a lot of chicle. If you haven't heard of chicle, maybe you've heard of a gum called chiclets. Chicle is gum, and Santa Anna was known to be a big fan of chicle, and he's chewing this gum, and I just imagine him chewing and watching America and scheming and thinking, well, what does the future actually hold for me? Texas was, well, maybe we were doomed to lose Texas anyway, but I hate slavers, and I'm next to a much scarier slave state called the United States of America. Once he's in Washington, D.C., well, there aren't many records of exactly what happened. We do know he met with the Secretary of State, but it is likely that Santa Anna also met personally with Jackson. It looks like they had dinner one night, and the two men were cordial. And we don't know exactly what they talked about because records aren't kept, but we do know these are two essentially monarchs discussing the future of the North American continent, and some sort of deal was reached. What we think happened was that most likely Santa Anna and Jackson agreed that the United States would buy Texas and California from Mexico for a sum of $3.5 million. And we also know that Santa Anna was put on a ship to return to Mexico, somewhat of a hero, because he did have quite a bit of cash with him when he returned. Now, remember how I had mentioned earlier that there was this other guy named Farias who took over for Santa Anna a lot of the administrative tasks that Santa Anna had? Well, he's really important in this time period because Santa Anna was president in absentia and Farias was controlling all of Mexico. And, well, Farias, he knew Santa Anna pretty well. He'd known that Santa Anna had occasionally switched sides, and he was really, really worried that Santa Anna would do exactly what Santa Anna did do. And so Farias declares Santa Anna an outlaw. He declares all of the agreements that Santa Anna made after he got captured in San Jacinto as void because he did it under the gun. And he assumes, while Santa Anna is in transit, he assumes responsibility for the leadership of Mexico. All his treaties, all his agreements were therefore void. But Farias, being a friend to Santa Anna for most of their lives, Farias said, well, why don't you just retire? You've had a big life. And Santa Anna, he's a little tired of being toted around and used as a pawn in these international affairs. And, he says, that's a great idea, Farias. And he retires. He decides to go to his hacienda in Vera, Cruz, and he's going to work on his memoirs. And if I were writing this book, or maybe I was going to make this into a movie or a play, this is where I would end Act 1 in a 3-act structure. I like this thought of, this venerated general who has seen action, which is just so fundamental to the history of the world, realizing that he has done quite a lot and made his impact in history, and he decides to just start writing a book about what he has done and accomplished. And this, for most people, this would be a great place to end their story. And so Santa Anna spends a full year working on his memoirs. And then something happened in the town of Tacubaya in the outskirts of Mexico City that, provided an opportunity to burn the world down once again. In that small town, there was a French pastry chef known only as Monsieur Remontel. Remontel claimed that 6 years prior, in 1832, Mexican officers looted his shop, stole his pastries, and had never given him any remuneration. He demanded 60,000 pesos in reparations, even though his shop was only worth about 1,000 pesos at the time. And when Santa Anna, who was president at the time when this happened, when Santa Anna didn't really give in to this, who knows? Maybe Mexican soldiers did raid his shop, but Santa Anna didn't pay the exorbitant sum, and so Remontel sent a letter to the French king, Louis Philippe. And this became something of a local fiasco. French pastry chefs in this Mexico City raised the alarm. There was a French pastry chef put down under the accusation of piracy. And all this news made it back to France until the Prime Minister of France demanded that Mexico pay 600,000 pesos, 10 times more than what the shop owner wanted, to, pay back this terrible pastry crime that happened in Mexico City. This is all real. This really happened. They started a war over pastries. The French sent their navy to Veracruz. Now, in truth, let's just think about this for a second. Mexico had gotten its independence, a few decades earlier, And these European colonial powers didn't really much like independent nations. They didn't like their colonies rebelling. And in this great game between colonial powers, maybe the French king didn't really care so much about pastries as much as he did about maybe taking Mexico for himself. This is the beginning of the Pastry War. That's a real war. And Santa Anna wasn't about to sit this one out. Santa Anna is sitting on a ton of cash, and he writes to Farias and says, I will raise an army and I will defend Vera Cruz. Farias, who is just a politician and not a military genius, has no choice but to accept. So in November to December 1838, Santa Anna wages war on the French from Vera Cruz. The French ships arrive outside. They're fighting, shooting cannons at the fleet from the fort, and vice versa. And eventually the French decide to stage a very daring raid on the fort in the middle of the night. They send in sort of essentially their special forces unit, their Marine brigade, and they have one mission, which is to capture Santa Anna personally. And they make it through the streets. They kill a bunch of people, and Santa Anna escapes during this battle. He gets on a horse, and he fights the French to a standstill. And in that conflict, a French grape shot from a cannon is fired in Santa Anna's direction, and it goes right through his leg, wounding him pretty seriously. And he fights from the saddle with this destroyed leg, and the French ultimately have to retreat. Honestly, it's a little unclear who really won the Pastry War. Many military historians will look back at this and say, look, the French were totally winning, but they probably had bitten off more than they could chew. They probably couldn't actually take over Mexico. And Mexico actually agrees to pay for all of those stolen pastries. But Santa Anna's fame is restored in Mexico. He, is the guy who lost Texas, but he's the guy who also beat the French. And Mexico likes this quite a bit. Quite famously, Santa Anna has to have his leg amputated because, medical technology at the time, the infection was going to get real bad. They amputate it. They don't amputate it very well. When you amputate a limb, you need to get a little extra skin flap to cover over the bone. And whatever quack surgeon he had hired didn't do a great job on his leg and didn't get the right skin flap. And it's never really a very good false leg. But Santa Anna does, and this is just such a wonderful little detail. He gives his leg a full military funeral, with the bands and the parade and all of that in Mexico City because, his leg fell duly in battle. And he is not one to not take his accolades where he can find them. In between, 1841 and 1844, Santa Anna is in and out of the presidency. He's in for like a week at a time. He comes out, he comes back, and all told in his career, I think he's president of Mexico 9 times. I might be wrong on that number, but it's like an insane amount of times that Santa Anna is president, and they're usually for short stints for various reasons. Anyway, he's taking more of a dictatorial role. Even though he started as an idealist, running a country is pretty darn hard. He's trying to crush rebellions. He's trying to centralize power. People like him, and then they don't like him, and then he defeats someone, and they all love him again, and then something bad happens. It's a presidency. It's a life. It's sort of like what dictators did at that time. Eventually, though, by December 1844, Santa Anna is sort of done. There are riots in the streets because of some of his policies are not very popular, and he steps down from power. And this is just a fascinating little side detail. The crowds are so enraged at Santa Anna that they go to the graveyard where his, military funeral blessed leg resides. They dig it up and they drag it through the streets of Mexico City. This really happened. It's crazy. Santa Anna flees off into the hinterlands because he doesn't want to get dragged through the streets himself. And then, some of this time period is a little bit unclear what happened. There is a very colorful anecdote, which I do not totally believe, but I will recount because I am a storyteller. It was written that at the time, Santa Anna was captured by an indigenous tribe who held him hostage, expecting that maybe they would get a ransom. And the story goes, I'll just recount the story. He is dressed in banana leaves and roasted on a spit, turned on one of these sort of almost cannibalistic spits. And we do know that some of the tribes in that time did have some pretty brutal tortures, and they're making fun of him as he literally roasts above a fire until they sort of laughingly let him go. The story's probably not true, but it was probably spread by his enemies at the time to humiliate him. They threatened to eat him, though, apparently, but instead they turn him over to the authorities, and he's sent into exile from there to Havana, Cuba. And Santa Anna is one of those guys who always just sort of lands on his feet. By June of 1845, he's running the most successful happening cockfighting ring in the city. It is a blast. There are, it is the place where the to see and be seen. It is fancy. And Santa Anna is just sort of like this honcho, this head honcho, just running the show and minting money. Can't make this stuff up. This is what Santa Anna was doing. And then in the fall of 1845, another interesting thing happens. Remember that secret deal that Santa Anna pulled off with Andrew Jackson that we really don't know much about? Well, the United States has been keeping an eye on Santa Anna this whole time. They see him winning wars, going in and out of the presidency, and they know that he is the guy. Like, if you got Santa Anna in your pocket, you have got a lot of stuff going for you. I mean, you can make some strategic moves in relation to Mexico that you couldn't if he wasn't on your side. So in fall of 1845, Santa Anna meets with the U.S. envoy, a guy named John Slidell, who offers to return Santa Anna to power and buy California for $25 million. It's unclear what Santa Anna said to this deal, but it's clear that he's playing a game with the United States. And it looks like, if he just, loses a little loyalty, he could gain a lot back in terms of his own personal finances. And maybe that $25 million would even go build some institutions that Mexico desperately needs. But nothing really happens all that serious. July 5th, 1846, yet another envoy comes. This is from the Polk administration. Polk is really eyeing Mexico at this time. He's thinking that just maybe, Mexico shouldn't own Mexico, right? America has been dealing with this idea of westward expansion for a very long time. It's our manifest destiny to go from coast to coast. But, by this point, Texas has already been absorbed into the United States, and the United States wants to get to the Pacific. It needs to get Mexico in order to do that. And so far, the Mexican government has not been amenable to just selling it. They're gonna have to take it with force of arms. Maybe Santa Anna can help. Now, I'm going to take just a little aside here and tell you that in 1846, America was a royal mess. The question of slavery was an enormous one. The North had abolitionists who were almost as fierce as Santa Anna in their desire for free slaves. The South had its slavers who were just as adamant as the Texans were. And there were also a hell of a lot of immigrants who came over from Europe and were being treated as second-class citizens, because it wasn't only the race of a person that was a deciding factor on how you treated other people. It was the fact if you were already in America, you just thought you were better than anyone else who came here. The United States started sending quite a few troops to the southern border of Texas along the Rio Grande, and they were looking for a way to provoke an accident, an incident, something that would give them a pretext for war. A whole bunch of the soldiers that they had manning those palisades were from Ireland. They were the Black Irish, if you were. They were the dregs of the American military, and they showed up and they had harps on their flags, but they were trained in the British Army. They were actually quite good soldiers. One of these guys named John Riley. Maybe I'll do another podcast just on John Riley. But eventually, there's a skirmish between the Mexicans and the Americans. The Americans say the Mexicans started it. The Mexicans say the Americans started it. And that buildup of troops turns into something of a hot war. John Riley has gone through a number of changes over his life. When he arrived in America, he hated minorities. But he was also being treated really, really poorly. Even though he was a great artilleryman, no one gave him the time of day. And he realized as he was on the Palisades that, well, the land of the free and the home of the brave, it ain't the United States. Right before the Mexican-American War kicks off in 1846, John Riley jumps the Palisades and goes to the other side with thousands of other Irish soldier immigrants. The Irish Brigade is hugely important and totally forgotten by us Americans who think that we're right no matter what, and that we're always on the right side. Well, John Riley didn't think so. So he switched sides and joined the Mexican army in about a week. He becomes an officer, and he becomes pretty pivotal in the battles that come later. Now, before I go back to what's happening with Santa Anna at this particular moment, it's fascinating as this whole story is, I want you to once again consider how awesome it is to listen to a free podcast where there are no ads, where you're not hearing about HelloFresh and you're not hearing about some sort of supplement that I'm definitely going to sell you that's going to make you amazing. And I'm going to just think of what a wonderful thing it would be if I could continue to give you this sort of content, these sorts of stories. And I have a lot of them. And so I'd like you to look down to the show notes and find it in your heart to access my Patreon so that you can get these episodes before anyone else, where you can have some input at what I do and maybe even meet me in the private Discord server. I, for one, would love this to become a real thing, and if there's any way I can do it without stuffing this full of annoying ads, I am all about that. Well, I guess this was sort of an ad, what I just told you, but I hope it's not as bad as, a Coca-Cola commercial. So check out my Patreon. There is a link down below, and it's just going to feel so awesome to have you as part of my little Scott Carney Investigates community. I do good stuff here, And if you got it this far, I mean, we're an hour into a podcast. If you got this far into this wonderfully free podcast, you might think to yourself, this is pretty cool. And it's cheaper than an audiobook. So please consider joining the Patreon, be part of the club. And if for whatever reason you're like, I don't got the money right now, or you just don't want to give to support a show that you're already getting for free. I get that too, because I also have done that. I have another request for you. And maybe this could even be a little fun, is I'd love you to leave a rating or a review on whatever platform you are currently listening on. And if you give me 5 stars, I will read your review on a future episode of this podcast. That's right. I'll even use your name if you want me to. And I will read your 5-star review. And this is something you can do that's completely free. And it would be sort of fun. So if you're into that, you have your directions. 5 stars, and I'll read about it here on this podcast. And you can say whatever you want. Well, mostly. I might censor you. Try not to get censored. And with that, back to Santa Anna in Havana. In July of 1846, Santa Anna had ironed out some sort of deal with an envoy from the Polk administration, and it was probably not in favor of Mexico. It was the sort of deal that a dictator would make, the sort of deal where you would sell out the country that you bled for money, for your own personal profit. Maybe you just felt that Farias and those other sellouts in Mexico City would never see your true genius, and you just took your golden parachute. Well, that's the deal that Santa Anna figured out with the Polk administration. And there is a naval blockade up and down the coast of Mexico that no boat can get through without American permission. And Santa Anna boards a U.S. gunboat under the agreement that he is going to be sure that Mexico doesn't put up much of a fight against the Americans. And he's got an enormous chest of money with him. He has $2 million of Polk's money. And as he's sailing towards the coast, the American army is leaving the Rio Grande. It's marching south, and you won't believe who's in that army. This is the largest military engagement that the United States has been in since the Revolutionary War. And in that time, we have only become a better military power. We are training excellent soldiers. And in this army is a guy named Robert E. Lee, a guy named Ulysses S. Grant, Jefferson Davis, and Zachary Taylor. You have heard all of these names before. They are critical in the Civil War. This is 1847. This is, about 13 years before the Civil War. Robert E. Lee is a dashing general in charge of some very important forces. Grant is a commissary officer. Jefferson Davis is the future president of the Confederate States of America. And Zach Taylor is a future president of America. This is an enormous military expedition, and they want to deliver a death blow to the Mexican government. I mean, just imagine for a second, if both sides of the Civil War were fighting together against a power with much worse weaponry, what would happen? Well, that's the Mexican-American War. And even that's not enough, because this group of inveterate soldiers fighting for they're not fighting for a good cause, right? I mean, at this point, America is fighting to steal Mexican land and territory. At this point, Abraham Lincoln is giving speeches about the corruptness of this military engagement and how we have no moral basis on which to take some other country's land for no good reason. I mean, the pretext of battle was thin, to say the very least. This was the true war of northern aggression. And America also has this secret weapon in their pocket. Santa Anna, their turncoat, is on the way across the sea, and he lands in Vera, Cruz. He immediately betrays the Americans. It is the most beautiful moment in this entire story. Santa Anna, since the moment he shook Jackson's hand right after the Alamo, he had been planning this all along. He comes bearing American money, and with that cash raises an army immediately to fight the Americans. He's the only general in Mexico with any competence, and he comes back forgiving all of the betrayals he's had over the years, some of which were deserved, some were not deserved. And he says, "Fuck off, America. I don't care that you have this huge industrial empire. I am going to defend the borders of my country, and I'm going to use your money when I do it." The general is back, baby. It takes him a little while to coordinate the disparate forces that are fighting, but he actually meets up with the Irish Brigade, all of these these Irish soldiers in the American army who have, gone to a country that actually appreciates freedom. And he gathers their military regiments together, and he uses their expertise in artillery, which is actually understudied and utilized in the Mexican army. And he, Riley and Santa Anna and all of these people march north against the Americans. And in February 1847, Santa Anna gets to this butte where he sees the forces of Zach Taylor and Jefferson Davis, who are not expecting Santa Anna to attack. The Americans have something at this time called flying artillery, which are cannons on wheels, whereas the Mexicans are using these cannons that have they look more like those pirate ship cannons. They have these like tiny little wheels instead of wagon wheels. It's not nearly as mobile as what the Americans have, but Santa Anna knows the terrain, and in Buena Vista, he corners Taylor and Jefferson Davis, and he attacks when they do not expect it. And it is just such a beautiful moment. And I just want to sit here for a second and think back to what we know about American history right now. Future President Zach Taylor, future Confederate President Jefferson Davis are pinned against the wall. Riley is incredibly accurate with his fire, and the Americans are getting decimated. It's sort of a beautiful thing, don't you think? And you think about how history is on a knife's edge. Well, right now, February 22nd, 1847 is that knife's edge. With the Americans unable to maneuver, Santa Anna is running low on ammunition. This is one of the problems with being in an underfunded military. And he looks and he realizes he's one charge away from stopping this American military force. And honestly, it was looking really, really bad for the Americans, because Riley's artillery regiment, for the very first time in the Mexican-American War, and maybe in the Mexican Army's history, he routed an artillery position and took the American cannons. He took the flying cannons that were their main advantage, and he captured them for the Mexican army. It was looking amazing for Santa Anna. You have these chants from the Irish soldiers behind him, cheering him on. And for the very first time in, I believe, Santa Anna's history, he does something which is uncharacteristic for him. He decides not to charge. This is one of those moments in history that, it coulda, woulda, shoulda been different. It's a moment where historians of this time period look back at it and realize that the entire world could have been completely different had Santa Anna done what Santa Anna had always done, which is charge. But instead, he decided that he could maybe reserve his forces and he could regroup in a way where he could out-strategize the Americans. And it's the turning point of the war. He never finds that moment again. And there's no way to know if maybe it was the right choice. Maybe he didn't have enough ammunition to actually pull it off. I just sort of wish that he had. From here, the Mexican-American War goes the way that you might expect that the Mexican-American War should have gone. By April, just 20 days later, Santa Anna is defeated at the Battle of Cerro Gorda, and he flees south with a dwindling military. In this battle, a lot of key records are burned, and Riley does make it out of there with Santa Anna, and it's the farce of Santa Anna's life. Santa Anna's prosthetic leg is again captured and taken as a trophy. I believe right now it resides in Minnesota. And it just gets worse and worse. In August of that year, there's another battle. It's called the Last Battle of the San Patricos. That's the Irish Brigade in defense of Mexico City. Riley is actually captured here, and Santa Anna flees south to Jamaica and Colombia. Meanwhile, the American forces force the Mexican government to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives basically the shape of North America that we get today, with just a few territorial differences. But California, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona used to be Mexico, ain't Mexico anymore. I've often wondered, does that treaty even count? I mean, does it stand in law? We went down there and we stole their land. We took it from them at gunpoint. Is that something that America is supposed to do? Is that the American dream right there, playing out in all of its glory? I mean, the president who actually signed the treaty was just installed to sign it. What does that mean in terms of law? We clearly didn't show that we were the pinnacle civilization at that time. Just ask Riley and the San Patricos, who turned coat so they could be treated somewhat fairly in a more egalitarian society. The San Patricos didn't fare very well. Riley was sentenced to death along with all of the other San Patricos, and they hung one after another. I believe Ulysses S. Grant may have been present at some of this. And, well, interestingly enough, Riley himself does escape hanging because, the charge for a traitor is death, but Riley actually fled to the Mexican army a day before war was officially declared, so he was sort of let off with just a light branding on his cheek, declaring him a traitor. Santa Anna, meanwhile, flees to Jamaica and Colombia, tries to start his life again. North America, all the northern lands, all the people who are living in Mexico at that time are given a choice. They can either become Americans or they can just leave all their stuff and go back down to Mexico. Many opted to go to Mexico, and many of those who stayed had their property rights not respected and their lands stolen from them. Even though the treaty very specifically said that Mexican citizens would be able to keep the land that they had only as Americans. Well, we didn't abide by that. Now, there's still actually quite a bit more history with Santa Anna. He becomes president again, at least one more time. In 1854, he sells the Gadsden Purchase. It's just a little bit of like a sliver of land for about $3 million. And Santa Anna this time he pockets the money personally. He's basically just broken at this point. He doesn't have a leg. He's lost a lot of his major battles. His idealism has failed. And eventually he's exiled again from Mexico under charges of corruption. It's so strange. Some people love him, some people hate him, and right now he's remembered as this sort of like robber baron. And a lot of his history, very promising history, is forgotten or explained away as not real. But Santa Anna does have a pretty interesting coda. In the late 1850s, to about 1875 or so, Santa Anna, who is a well-known socialite, who is sort of reviled in Mexico, in his home country, decides to try his hand at business. He decides to start a company. And it's a little unclear from the records exactly how successful it is, but he starts a company called Adams Chewing Gum Company, and he starts importing chicle to the United States, which is chewing gum, which eventually we're talking about Wrigley's. We're talking about a major food item, and Santa Anna brings that concept of chewing gum to America because he's always loved it, and he chewed on it when he was going across America right after he was arrested after the Alamo, and he moves to Staten Island to write his memoirs. And he does write some of his memoirs, and this is a true tragedy in history. On a carriage ride to New York, his trunk full of papers gets lost, and many of his, personal letters are just gone. And so the autobiography that he does eventually write, called The Eagle, it's not very good. I'll just be honest, it's not very good. But Santa Anna sort of ends his career as a chewing gum importer. And that, well, it's quite a coda. He's sick, and he just wants to end up in Mexico. And he does. He writes a petition to the Mexican government, and he tells them that he's dying. And they let him come back, and he dies in Mexico City in June of 1876. And he's buried with full military honors. This is the story of Santa Anna. These are the broad strokes. And I think, at the very beginning, I asked you to give me a chance to convince you that he's one of the most important people in North American history. Many-time president of Mexico, delivered Mexico from the Spanish, fought the Americans, almost won the Civil War, because if he had killed Jefferson Davis, what would have that meant? He fought many times on the right side. He won the Alamo, and frankly, he's the hero of the Alamo as far as I'm concerned. There was no reason that the Alamo should be hailed and haloed the way it is. They were fighting to establish slavery against a sovereign state. Santa Anna came to defend those people. If you're against slavery, you're for Santa Anna. I've often thought about Santa Anna's story, and I eventually would love to write something more serious about it. I could see a great historical fiction about him. It would be, I wrote this book with Jason Meiklin, my co-author on it, called The Vortex, historical fiction about the deadliest storm in human history and how that almost led to nuclear war. And it was a real amazing story. It reads like a novel, but it's nonfiction. And I'd do that again, I think, but maybe it would be more fun to sort of play with these scenes, because one of the problems with The Vortex, one of the problems with writing The Vortex, not reading it, but one of the problems with writing The Vortex, it was so hard to get dialogue from people who are 50 years ago. And just imagine how hard it would be to get dialogue from Santa Anna. Maybe one day I'll write it. Maybe there's another iteration where I could retell it, and Santa Anna's like a vampire. Maybe there's a vampire Santa Anna book to be written. Maybe I'll think about that. If you liked this story, if you like this grand sweep of history, go tell a friend about this podcast. Share this with somebody in Texas and see what they think. My guess is that they're not going to like it, because we all have these heroes. I also loved Davy Crockett's Disney specials as a kid. I get why hearing this may not be, Davy Crockett and the Alamo is an American memorial, something that is some of our sacred ground. But I think we should re-examine that sacred ground. We should think about what that really meant, what they were really fighting for. So share this history with somebody in Texas, and share this history with somebody who's not in Texas too. And thank you so much for being here. From Pokey Bear LLC, this is Scott Carney Investigates. Thank you so much for listening. Give me one of those ratings down there below, and maybe if it's 5 stars, I'll read it on my next show.